Thank you so much. Thank you, Lutz, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm grateful to all the departments that contributed to make it possible for me to come here. I'm really excited to talk to you about an author whose work I really love and have been translating for quite some time. This is going to be a talk about translation. It will be a talk about her work, but what you'll see, I hope, is that when you start talking about translation, quickly you go from one detail into like a whole big story, and that is one of the things that has drawn me into talking and thinking and being a practitioner within the field of translation. So Erpenbeck is somebody that I've been translating for 14 years. My translation of her book, The Old Child and Other Stories, came out in 2005. That was our first time working together. And that was a book that in English had a very different form than in German. The Old Child and Other Stories contained a novella and stories. In German, these had been published separately, but you would never in English publish just a 100-page book by a completely unknown author. At the time, nobody in the US, including me, knew that she was going to be a major literary star and one of the most important writers in Germany right now. Had we all known that at the time, I think the publisher would have wanted to issue the books separately, exactly as they had appeared in German, but that's that hindsight thing. Even in her first book, The Old Child, which in German is called Story of the Old Child, Geschichte vom alten Kind, her characteristic weirdness is already present, a perspectival sleight of hand. It's a book that is told from a close third-person point of view, but conceals who the main character who's narrating really is. Which of these things is going to move this? Yes, technology handled so far. So Erpenbeck, how many, just for reference, how many people in the room have read or know something about her? Okay, so a few of you, but most of you not. She's a writer who's really concerned with history and the way in which individual human history makes up historical history, the thing you read about in books. Her whole big project, I would say, is to show how everything that is global and historical and of national importance is really just stories of people, individual people put together, and in her work she breaks this down. These are the books of hers that are out in English, which I translated because it's a usual thing that if you become a book's translator and it goes well, the publisher wants the same person to continue and to do book after book to keep the voice consistent. There are some exceptions to that, but it's not unusual for the same person to stick with the same writer as the translator. So here are her books available in English. Of them, I don't know. I think my favorite are Visitation and The End of Days, but I like all of them. Visitation is the story of a house. It is 100 years of German history told through the overlapping stories of all the generations of people who lived in a certain house, which is located outside of Berlin in the countryside. Because of the location of the house, whenever there was any sort of political unrest in Germany, whoever was living there had to flee. And so you have generation after generation who had to flee, and their stories are sort of overlapping, and that's the novel. It's like a family saga, except the saga is the story of the house. And The End of Days, it's the story of one character, but that character is many characters, and the book tells in these long chapters the different stories that one character could have had if she had made different decisions. The book, you follow her life and it ends with a decision, and then the book says, but if she had done this other thing, and then you get these, so, all these different possible lives. So it's like the opposite of Visitation. But the hallmarks of Jenny Erpenbeck's style, which are what a translator has to be thinking about, because I'm encountering her books not on the macro level as a reader does, but on the micro level, because I have to encounter each sentence and think about what to do in English. So I think a lot about the hallmarks of her style, and I would describe them as extreme lyricism, sentence rhythms constructed on long breaths, sentences that in English would count as run-on sentences, but that's not such a worry in German. The German language is more hospitable to the very long sentence than English is, but she is particularly long, even for German sentences. Her sentences give an impression that is paratactic or paratactical. This is a term about sentences, a lit-crit term. It means that the long sentences are put together like a train with its boxcars, a unit, then an and, blah, 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 and blah, 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 or blah, 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 blah. But if you look at her prose, as a translator does closely, her sentences are extraordinarily hypotactical. That means that the sentences are with clauses inside clauses. The person who did blah, 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 which before this, but after blah, 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 lots and lots of nesting structures within them. But she creates this impression of forward motion like a paratactical sentence would. And that is a interesting challenge for the translator. How many people in this room can read some German? Most of y'all, not everybody, but a lot of you. You don't have to read German to understand this talk, but I decided to put some sentences up for those who can. Now, for those of you who understand some German, you can read this. I'm not going to read the whole passage. This passage is very hypotactical. It's very stacked clause-y. But note how the auch die in the second to last line picks up the thread of auch die erwachsene Frau, which I'm going to explain in English in a sec, creating a paratactical sense of forward motion despite the hypotaxis. So I'm going to read you now what this sounds like in English. It's the opening of the novel, The End of Days. The Lord gave, and I'm going to read from a little before this sentence. The Lord gave and the Lord took away, her grandmother said to her at the edge of the grave. But that wasn't right because the Lord had taken away much more than had been there to start with, and everything her child might have become was now lying there at the bottom of the pit, waiting to be covered up. 3 handfuls of dirt, and the little girl running off to school with her satchel on her back now lay there in the ground, her satchel bouncing up and down as she runs ever farther. 3 handfuls of dirt, and the 10-year-old playing the piano with pale fingers lay there. 3 handfuls, and the adolescent girl whose bright coppery hair men turn to stare at as she passes was interred. 3 handfuls tossed down into the grave, and now even the grown woman who would have come to her aid when she herself had begun to move slowly, taking some task out of her hands with the words, "Oh, mother." She, too, was slowly being suffocated by the dirt falling into her mouth. So there's an example of this sort of forward motion, I think, despite all the complexity. And you can see from this opening passage, she's talking about the death of a baby and all the lives the baby would have had. But this is a novel that keeps taking back everything it takes away. And the novel shows us all these lives, even though in the first paragraph of the book, they're taken away. So in the novel, The End of Days, this hypotaxis disguised as parataxis is emblematic for a thematic situation in which each part of the story, what's come before, seems to follow after the other, but in fact, each is a re-envisioning and recreation of what we thought was the life story we'd been reading. So this complex structure where everything is part of everything else is thematically crucial. It's the book's entire premise that every autobiographical story is a sort of myth-making. So now Go Went Gone, the newest book. It came out in German in 2015, the English translation 2017, because it takes a while to get a book translated and copy edited and printed. It was rushed into print in Germany because the subject matter was so current, and the publisher said, there's a refugee crisis, you've written a book about this, can we get this into print yesterday? And so in Germany, I think the book came out something like 3 months after she wrote the last sentence, which is extraordinary. extraordinary. In English, it went through its usual long, slow process. This is a book that is complicated in all sorts of ways. I'm going to be talking about the complications from the translator's point of view. Those of you who've read the book, we can discuss more in the Q&A about other sorts of complexities in the novel. From the point of view of the translator, this book has a special set of complexities related to the implied multilingualness of the German. So to give it to you in one sentence, this is a novel about an old retired classics professor who happens to meet a number of asylum seekers from a number of countries, all African countries. They're all men who were displaced by the war in Libya and came to Germany via Italy, via Libya, and had come from originally a number of other countries, Mali, Niger, Ghana, Nigeria, and Chad, for example. The conversations that the main character has with these other characters we're to understand in English, sometimes in Italian, but we're reading this in German. So everything is, there's a multilingualness filtered through English and filtered through the English of this German-speaking character for whom English is also a second language. So the book, we're reading German, we're understanding this as the reader that it's representing English and other languages. And the book is written almost entirely in German, but partly in English. There are a number of brief fragments and phrases that often sound quite odd to an American reader, either because of the way the characters were based on speak, and all the characters in the book were based on actual real-life people who Jenny Erpenbeck met and interviewed at great length, and in many cases befriended, and is still very much involved in the lives of. So there's a lot of personal investment of the author in these stories. So the way they speak reflects the English in the book, and the Italian, but there's not so much Italian in here, I think just a phrase or two. Also because we have a German language author writing in English, she has pretty good English, but it's still not a language she's comfortable in writing in. She's trusting her own English as a writer. For example, our main character, Richard, becomes aware of the asylum-seeking characters when he sees news footage of them holding up signs that say, "We become visible." And this English of "we become visible" is a kind of English that a German speaker might use in English. It may have, so it's hard to tell where the filtering comes in. Is it a non-native speaker of English who's using English that way? Is it the author who's using English that way, or is it the narrator who's remembering the English that way? So there's a level of this complexity, but it's definitely not German English when a character says, "A real school is more better." That's a phrase that clearly comes from the interviews. So for me, as translator, one big problem is making sure that the contrast between the quoted in English bits of the novel and the part of the novel that's presented in very literary, elegant English do not seem at odds with each other in the translation. All these things need to be plausible as the thoughts of the same character. This task is made somewhat easier by the fact that most of the African characters in the novel who have weak English skills speak in only very short fragments or gestures. I'm going to read a brief passage, a conversation. The main character, Richard, has gone to a cafe with a young man named Osorobo, and his idea is that he's doing something nice for Osorobo by taking him to a cafe, and he soon finds that he's created a socially very awkward and uncomfortable situation. So he asks him, "What would you like to drink? Coffee, tea, hot chocolate, juice, water?" The boy shakes his head. "Would you like a piece of cake?" The boy shakes his head. "Tea?" The boy shrugs. "Do you want herbal tea, green tea, black tea?" "Nothing." "Green? Black?" The boy shrugs. "Black then. And cake?" The boy shakes his head. Richard goes to the counter to order black tea and a cappuccino. He never drank cappuccino during GDR times. He's an East German. So it's part of the theme of the book, too, the new total Germany, which is, for his purposes, West Germany is new to him. He never drank cappuccino during GDR times, but he got into the habit when he went to Italy. It would never have occurred to him during the previous 40 years that he could ever acquire a habit in Italy. What's your name? Osarobo. Already the black tea is arriving along with the cappuccino, with its cap of frothy milk dusted with cocoa and a little cookie on the saucer. Where are you from? Niger. Later I stayed with my father in Libya. The sugar he adds to his coffee slips through the frothy milk into the depths. Do you still have family in Niger? A mother and a sister. How old is your sister? 14 or so. He stirs the sugar. And what's her name? Sabina. Do you call them sometimes? No. And your father? The boy shakes his head. Do you talk about the war with your friends from Oranienplatz? Sometimes. Is there anyone here you know from Libya? No. I lost all my friends. Soft background music is playing. A woman is buying some cake. That'll be €11.60. I saw them die. Many, many people died. The woman leaves the shop with her packet. The sliding glass doors open automatically before her. Osarobo's tea is standing there untouched. Richard's cappuccino also stands untouched. Life is crazy, says Osarobo. Oh yeah. Richard wishes he knew what questions would lead to the land of beautiful answers. Do you go for a walk sometimes? Richard asks, but Osarobo misunderstands. He thinks he's being asked about work. Yes, I want to work, but it's not allowed. Richard thinks of Mozart's Tamino and how he is tested. In front of every door he tries to open, a voice makes him stop. Go back. What is your mother tongue? Hausa and Tebu. How do you say hand in Hausa? Hanu, and I, Idu. T, Shai, I, Ni, U, K. Okay, so they continue their conversation. I'm going to pick up the part where the English words are incorporated into this passage. So obviously the incorporation of the words walk and work is going to be a little different in the English language context, where the reader is not going to experience these words as artifacts. So, gehst du manchmal spazieren? Walk, fragt Richard. Richard. So in the German, the English words are inserted as extra elements. In English, it's incorporated. So I didn't do the insertion because that would have been confusing in the English language context. In a sense, this passage is reverting to its original Englishness and getting rid of the filter of Germanness. So there are a number of places in the book where things like that is done. Okay, and some of the dialogue sounds unfamiliar to American readers of the book. Let's see a couple of examples here. So the last few lines of this whole passage, he asks him, "Oh, sorry, I have forgot." I have forgot. This is a marker that the character speaks a different English than, say, an American reader is used to. In general, I tried to keep these in the book. Sometimes things happen in the editing process, and when I was preparing this talk, I realized that this was exactly one of those places. Look at the copy-edited manuscript. So when you translate a book, you give it to your editor, and your editor edits the manuscript, and then you get back the edited manuscript, and then you fight with the editor about passages, and sometimes you lose the battles and or you forget to fight about a certain passage. And this is one that I forgot to fight about. And so the editor normalized that into American style, which is a shame, and I wish that I had fought for that. But in a book of 300 and something pages, things happen with translations. This is shocking. In the End of Days, there was a converse set of problems. So there's a number of passages in that book. There are a lot of Jewish characters, and there are a lot of passages in which Yiddish is used, which, well, at least the expressions that Jenny Erpenbeck picked to use in her book were, I would say, immediately comprehensible to speakers of German. Like here, does anyone in the room, does anyone in the word speak Yiddish? Yeah. Would you read that actually nicely, the first line? Okay, so it sounds very much like the German, falle mir meine Treppe nicht herunter, falle mir meine Treppe nicht herunter. So that's something that has a it's a foreign language that has transparency in German for readers of German, and that is not going to be the case in English. Here's the passage. I'll read just the English. The bundle was so small and light. This is more about the funeral of the baby that we saw the beginning of in the first bit I read. The bundle was so small and light that one of them had to hold it in place as they descended the stairs, otherwise it would have rolled off. Sei Michael und fall mir meine Treppe nicht herunter. Do me a favor, don't go falling down the stairs. A favor. She knew the baby had to be buried before the day was out. So in English, I had to do the opposite of what happened with the walk-work passage in Go Went Gone. I had to provide a gloss for that, which in German is not glossed. In German, the only part that is glossed is the first bit, sei Michael, which is not transparent. Sei so gut is, I translated as do me a favor, for the part of the only part of Yiddish that was not transparent. So I glossed the entire thing. Do me a favor, don't go falling down the stairs. And then I repeated a favor to follow her emphasis in the passage, but also because that was the important part of the observation, of the remembered sense. She's remembering a sense that someone had spoken to her, someone of an older generation had spoken to her before. Also, note the difference in spelling between the Yiddish in the German and the Yiddish in the English. Yiddish, which is written in Hebrew characters, right? So Yiddish is not written in, this is not what Yiddish looks like if properly written. It's written with Hebrew characters. So it has to be transliterated, and in German, the transliteration rules are different from the English transliteration rules for Yiddish. So that made an interesting translation challenge in and of itself. I wound up, as a translator, you're always looking for people who have the specialized knowledge you need, and in this case, I called up the folks at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, who specialize in Yiddish literature, and one of them, Sebastian Schulman, fixed my spelling to accord with the transliteration scheme that was developed by the YIVO Institute in New York, which he described to me as the Académie Française of Yiddish. So these are the experts on how Yiddish should be spelled in English. So I have the latest research on that reflected in the translation. Here's another interesting bit of, wait a minute. Hey, you've gone too, really? Darn it. Okay, well, there we go. I'm missing a slide that I thought I made, but I didn't make. The slide should have showed the word Kindbettzettel, which is on the middle of the second line with the hyphen, Kindbettzettel. So that is a Yiddish word that has been turned into German, and I wound up having to really do a gloss. Amulets printed with Psalm 21, because I did research and, well, that's what it always is. And she's got the Psalm 21 there too. So the word amulets. So the Yiddish has vanished from my English, which is a shame. The Yiddish word, however, would not have been comprehensible to English-speaking readers, and because of the passage, I decided that having the actual Yiddish word in there was not the right move for this passage. So there's a lot of judgment calls. Here's another fun Yiddish one. Schlamassel is not schlamazel. So schlamassel, German speakers, is what? So ein Schlamassel? Yeah, what a mess. Messed up situation, a mess. What's a schlamazel? You English speakers who know that word? Yeah, a person with bad luck. So in Yiddish, the word schlamazel has both meanings, but weirdly, one meaning of the word has made its way into English Yiddish, and the other has made its way into German so thoroughly that I think most German speakers are not aware that it's a Yiddish word to begin with. But sorry, schlamassel is schlamazel. Now you know. Unfortunately, what a disaster. So ein Schlamassel is a leitmotif in the End of Days. The phrase, that word appears over and over again in the book, and it is a darn shame that I could not translate it with schlamazel because it would have the complete wrong meaning. She uses a lot of leitmotifs in her books, actually in a way that's kind of Wagnerian. And they're a big translation problem because you have to make sure that you translate them the same way every time they appear, which is much easier now that we have computers. When I first started translating, everything was done on typewriters, and if you wanted to revise your draft, you started typing it again from scratch because that's what it was. I got my first computer. Yeah, when I first met you, I didn't have a computer. You got a computer before I got a computer. I got a computer about a year later. I was a later adopter, and that computer really improved my translation life, I have to say. But imagine that you have a book with leitmotifs in it that you very painstakingly translated the same way, and then you give the manuscript to your editor to edit. Can you imagine all the things that go wrong? The editor doesn't realize it's a leitmotif and edit it one way because the editor is, reading the first 20 pages of it in his office, and then like the second 20 pages a week later on the train, and the third 20 pages. There's a lot of catching up and removing the errors that, it's a wonder that translations make it into print in any decent form ever. All right, let's go back to Go, Went, Gone. Here's another whole other sort of problems. Very interesting translation issues come up in chapter 52 of the book, which is when our main character starts looking things up on the internet. It's a moment in the story where he's feeling great distress because his house has been burgled, and he thinks that one of the asylum seekers who he's helping is the burglar. And he feels very guilty for thinking that. There's all kinds of things that suggest it's the case, but he doesn't know that. So he's thinking it, and at the same time he's hating himself for thinking it, and thinking maybe it was all just a misunderstanding and a coincidence. So he's having a lot of feelings, and like we do when we have a lot of feelings, he starts doing research on the internet to make himself feel better. And in chapter 52, Jenny Erpenbeck, tells us about his internet research. And it turns out that pretty much everything that gets quoted in the novel in chapter 52 comes from German Wikipedia. That, Wahrscheinlichkeit, probability, Gewissheit, certainty. See, these are the things he's looking up to make himself feel better and decide what to do about this this conundrum. Does he talk to the guy? Does he not talk to the guy? Does he just say, whatever happened, I don't care? So he's looking up probability, certainty. This takes him to Schrödinger's cat. This takes him to cat state, quantum death, quantum immortality. So we have quotes from German Wikipedia, but not quoted, you know, directly. She quotes big chunks actually directly, but then she rearranges parts, she quotes some things, rearranges them. Basically, she's using German Wikipedia as a source of found material. The quotes become building blocks as she assembles this part of her text. And the result really does sound like someone reading the internet in German. So problem, you know, when I first figured out, oh, it's Wikipedia, I just thought, oh, well, this is going to be the easiest translation job ever, right? I just quote from English Wikipedia. My job is done. Yeah. So just quoting from English Wikipedia doesn't work because the articles are structured very differently and conceived very differently, and everything's described in way more different terms than you might think. English Wikipedia is in no way a translation of German Wikipedia. Both have been built, you know, by teenagers writing things on the internet, basically. But a direct translation of German Wikipedia, if I were just to translate it, it would wind up sounding way too complicated and literary to be plausible as extracts from an English language web surfing session. So, you know, what to do? What to do? I sure spent a lot of time looking at English Wikipedia in a hopeful way. Can I do something with this? Can I do something with this? And found no, really not, because the quotes would not have the same thematic resonance and relevance to the main character as the bits in German. She carefully chose and curated the bits she quoted, and some of the key terms that are important for the novel wouldn't have been there. So in the end, I wound up quoting some lines from English Wikipedia, even if they did not directly correspond to anything in the German. Don't tell Jenny. Using collage technique to get the wiki tone established, because there is like a Wikipedia sounds like Wikipedia, you know, it's this kind of scientific written by teenagers tone, you know. And then I did translate some parts directly from German to create an assemblage in English that I think does sound like something from the internet while still hitting the main thematic points. For example, the sections probability and certainty that I translated each begin with a quote from English Wikipedia and then revert to following the German. Wikipedia is always changing, both in German and English. So, you know, these are screenshots I took around when I was working at it, thinking I might need these later because what's Wikipedia going to look like later? Okay. Jenny's German and my English for probability. If you know German, you will see that there is very, very little correspondence between this German text and this English text. If you want, I can, in the Q&A, put the slide back up and we can talk about it if you want. But there is really not so much overlap between my, you know, my translation of her text. In how far is it a translation? Well, it's a rewriting. I've followed her method in creating a written passage. But in fact, translators do way more writing than you would imagine. There is way less possibility of just doing in English what somebody else did in German than you would think. Every time you are reading a translation, you are so in the hands of the translator. You know, this is not at all what she wrote. Here's certainty, a little longer. I used the first two sentences of the English Wikipedia definition there. Certainty is perfect knowledge that is entirely safe from error, or the mental state of being without doubt. Doesn't that sound like Wikipedia? It is Wikipedia. And then, so my first two sentences are from Wikipedia, and then I swerved into translating the third and fourth sentences from German and tinkered with them until they sounded more like Wikipedia English. So it's not super faithful translation, but it's somewhat faithful to what Jenny Erpenbeck wrote and somewhat faithful to what Wikipedia is. For the other, Schrodinger's cat state, quantum death, quantum immortality, the way these entries appear on the German Wikipedia differ so much structurally from how they do in English. Like, some of them are their own articles, and some aren't even their own articles in different ones. So it's a collage technique, and this is a technique. This collaging technique is one that I developed when I was working on the translation of a novel from the 1960s by a writer named Ludwig Harrich, whose name you don't hear that much, Die Reise nach Bordeaux. This is a trip to Bordeaux. It's a road trip story in which a bunch of friends from Germany pile in the car and drive to France, and it's a novel in which every chapter, I think there's 29 chapters, each chapter has a distinctively different style. The author of the novel is also the guy who translated, he died, translated Raymond Queneau into German. So if you know the guy who wrote Exercises in Style, where you have like one short scene told in 99 different styles. Anyway, his novel, A Trip to Bordeaux, Bordeaux for him is all about Hölderlin and Montaigne. And he's got 4 chapters devoted to Montaigne that are 100% made up of quotes from Montaigne's work. But you would never know it because they're not like even entire sentences quoted. He quotes sentence fragments. And he's put together sentence fragments from Montaigne essays and made them into chapters of his novel, which it took me for a long time to figure that out. And when I finally figured it out, I started trying to translate those passages to make them sound like a collage, and it just didn't work because our brains make connectedness. Our brains cannot help trying to create coherence. It's really hard to intentionally create incoherence. And a collage is a technique that gets you there by automatic techniques, and I have never been able to do it with my brain as well as I can do it by collaging. And so I had that German book full of Montaigne quotes. I had a concordance in French of the works of Montaigne, and I, from the German, guessed what the key French words were, used them to find the source of the quotes in the concordance, and then found the corresponding essays in an old translation of Montaigne into English, which I then cut and pasted. This took way longer than just translating it would have, but it came out way better. I could not have done it as well. That the book also has, Ludwig Harrich's Trip to Bordeaux also has a chapter that's from Rabelais. And I thought, okay, well, this is good. I will just go and find the Rabelais, in English, because, Rabelais, mid-16th century, Harrich was quoting from the Fischart translation, Geschichtsklitterung, from the late 16th century, and there is a great 17th century translation of Rabelais by Thomas Urquhart. So I'm just thought, okay, I'll just go find the corresponding passages, only to discover that Fischart, in his German translation of Rabelais, had added a bunch of chapters, including that one. So then I had to kind of guess, how would Urquhart have translated this? That was hard. Anyway, do we want to talk about more of this? You know what? I'm not even going to talk about this. I think we should break in a sec for, let's break for Q&A because I've gone on too long. But I do want to say one thing first, one thing I'll say about this. One thing I will say about this. My translation, so I have the English Wikipedia, the German Wikipedia, the English Wikipedia. No, I will tell you this. She uses the first sentences of the German Wikipedia article. So her novel corresponds exactly to the German. Those sentences correspond most closely to sentences in the second paragraph of the English Wikipedia, the one that I bold-faced there. And so I used part of one of those sentences, combining it with a direct translation from the German. But it was really important to end on the note of isolation. The last word in German, abschirmen, abzuschirmen, is to isolate, is isolation, and it's thematically important. And so no matter what I was doing, I wanted to end with the thought of isolation because I'm reading thematically. And this is a way in which translation really overlaps with other forms of literary study, because you set emphases in the book by how you phrase things and how you structure sentences. So these things on the sentence level really influence what it feels like the book is about. So you have to be really aware of resonances and what you're trying to draw attention to. So every translation is really the translator's interpretation of the work. So those are the main points I want to hit. Let's break for discussions. I'm happy to talk about Erpenbeck, anything about this book, the other book, anything about being a translator, my life as a translator, anything you want.
So I have a question about, you mentioned that you work with an editor.
Yes.
You translate these things. Does the editor have a knowledge of German?
Usually not.
Usually not. So they're just like taking your word for the
That is correct, yeah. The editor is somebody who does not care at all whether your book represents the German. The editor cares only that you have got a text that reads well in English, is going to be marketable, that people will enjoy reading in English. Really, editors, unless you're maybe an academic press that has, you know, a translation that's supposed to have scholarly value, you know, merit. In that case, that would be a different story, but your average editor is not interested in that fact. I have worked exactly once in my life with an editor who had strong German, and it was for when I translated this crazy 19th century horror story by Jeremias Gotthelf called The Black Spider, which is like one of the scariest things I ever read in my life. The spider is basically sent there because people have sinned, and the spider can only get you when your faith in God wavers. Are you scared yet? It's written in 19th century, really, really gnarly prose parts of it, and the editor actually went back and looked at the German and helped me ungnarl some of it, so that was really helpful, but usually I'm on my own. It means both, that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Heimsuchung, I mean, Heim has like the sort of like Heimat, or but it also means Heimsuchen also means to haunt, right? So.
But so does but a visitation is also a haunting.
Yeah.
That's a thing. I mean, so a word like Heimsuchung is untranslatable, literal, and that's the novel that's about the house with all the generations of people who fled from it. So usually the titles are not just the translator alone. Usually it's a big conversation between the editor, the publisher, and the translator, because they, you know, I mean, my translation of Yoko Tawada's novel Etüden im Schnee, which translates as Etudes in Snow, is called in English Memoirs of a Polar Bear. And Etüden im Schnee was Yoko Tawada's own German translation of her Japanese original, which translates as The Student of Snow. So visitation was the hardest one to come up with, because Heimsuchung means two things. The word literally, you know, etymologically in its parts means seeking home, but Heimsuchung, what it really means is a haunting. And I really, you know, visitation was actually a publisher's suggestion. I didn't come up with that originally, but then the more I thought about it, the more I loved it, because it also means a haunting. But also, if you're thinking of it, like the house is being haunted by, you know, all the people, or the ghosts of all the people who lived there and had to leave and who are now dead. And visitation gets you that thematics from a different angle. It's not seeking home, it's the thematic notion that each person was just visiting. And it's telling a similar thematic story from a different angle. So in the end, I actually really, really love that title, even though you can, on first glance, say, wait, completely different word, unconnected. So half of the books I've done have been dead authors, which are you know, the author cannot dislike your work and tell you about it. On the other hand, if there's a thing you don't understand and you're like, what's the most important part about the sentence? What's the emphasis? You could ask the author, and that author you can't. Like some with Jenny Erpenbeck, you know, done so many books together that, you know, we have conversations about everything about the book. And in fact, with Go Went Gone, there's a translators colony in Germany that has, when a book is being translated into a bunch of languages at once, it has these author workshops where, in this case, they invited her and 9 translators who were translating the book into different languages, and we spent like 3 days together going through the book page, like, who has a question on page 30, who has a question on page 31, with the author. So, you know, frantically taking notes, right? This was kind of useful. And also, she's the kind of author who, if a translator writes her an email with a question, she writes down that question and her answer, emails it to the translator, and then puts it in a computer file, translator questions. And then when another translator is doing the book, she'll send you the Q&A. So she's a particularly well-trained author in that respect. But it can be difficult. It can be extremely difficult working with authors who've never been translated before, because an author who's never been translated before is somebody who's really nervous and suspicious about the process and really wants there to be a word-to-word correspondence between what they wrote and what they didn't, which leads to conversations like, why did you translate my word house as building when English contains the perfectly good word house? And I'm answered, because your house is 60 stories tall and made of glass and steel. But she's thinking that the word building has a very different vibe than the word house. And she's right, but the word house would be the wrong word for a skyscraper in English, whereas in German you can, you know, a house can be as tall as you want it to be. The words overlap in meaning but are not identical. But the author, she was very afraid that I was changing the atmosphere, the feeling of her text a lot. And the truth is that every translation radically changes the feeling of a text because it's in a different language, and different languages signify in different ways, sound different ways, are lyrical in different ways, are rhythmical in different ways. And that's all, you know, really interesting. Another conversation I had with a young author who was unhappy with something I'd done in her translation was, she had written a book about a wrestler who was having a really bad day, and at the end of the story, inadvertently maybe breaks his opponent's neck. A really bad day. And the last words of the story in German was dieses Knacken, which is this cracking, snapping. But like when you say, if you say this snapping, this snap, at the end it's like, you know, something different. You don't have in German, that word is like gory, and like it really has a punch. And I wound up translating it the sound of something snapping, which I thought was as close as I could to getting the punch of that last moment. But she was really unhappy because she's like, no, I want that sound. I want that one word to have that work. And in English, that crack. It's not, you know, the words work in different, all the available words are not going to do the job. And she didn't quite believe me, you know, and there's a certain point where, like, I understand why you don't believe me, but it's really the case. So that can happen, but usually the more authors get translated, the more accustomed they get, I can't speak now, I'm tired, but you know, the more familiar they get with the process and that the texts are going to change. And like Yoko Tawada, who's an author that I also just completely super adore, I'm teaching a novel of hers, The Emissary, this fall, which was translated not by me, translated from, she's a Japanese writer who writes in German and in Japanese. She was already living, she moved to Germany and was already living in Germany when she became a writer. And she first started writing Japanese, but she was living in Germany in German, so she also soon started writing in German. Now she writes books in both languages, whatever she happens to feel like writing that day. And she, because, I think maybe because of this fluidity of her writing between languages, she loves the way texts change in translation. She's always like egging her translators on. It's like, go ahead, make it English, you know, do things to it. And she wrote one story called Where Europe Begins, which is this train trip from whatever it's called, where you at the far end of Russia, where you can get on the Trans-Siberian Railway that goes all from the coast of Russia all the way over to Moscow. And she's got a Japanese character who's riding the train and is like having all these like experiences of many different cultures in her brain that are making her brain explode. She's remembering her grandmother's tales, stories her mother told her, stories about her mother's childhood. She's reading books of fairy tales from the various different Siberian peoples who populate the area that the train is passing through, and Russian stories, and having conversations in different languages with Russian people, and there's like a Frenchman. And then at the end of the journey, there's this moment where she arrives in the train station and that everything just turns into this psychedelic, like really complicated, surreal experience. And the words that spell out the name Moscow turn into like these objects and creatures and like take on a life of their own. And so she's spelling out things from the story with the letters M, you know, O, S, K, you know, that spell out Moscow in German. She wrote the story in German. And, you know, things in different languages begin with different letters of the alphabet, you know, and it just so happens that the word mother begins with the same letter in German and English. That's handy, but there's lots of other words that don't, you know, begin with the same letters, and that created a lot of problems. And so I had to make up this whole different alphabet soup, and she was like, and so I sent her different versions of it, and she's like, I like that one, but she was loving it. She's like, this is great, this is becoming this whole other thing, and you've, you know, added things to the story. I added the concept umbilical cord, which hadn't been in the story, because I needed something. Oh yeah, I had the word knife. I needed the word knife for some reason, and that's how I got the word knife in the story. It was severing her umbilical cord. Anyway, I forgot the question, so I hope I answered it. Yeah, I mean, I think that translation of that novel is weird into English. I mean, particularly because it's a novel where we have, you know, a white character talking to and meeting a lot of characters of color, and approaching them in a way that is not really in line with how such an encounter would happen in the United States. You know, it's politically weird, you know, that I was not really comfortable with that, in fact. You know, that's a whole area of the book, of complexity around that book, that I think I was really surprised that almost all but one of the reviewers of the book in the US didn't say anything about that. I was expecting reviewers to say something about that, actually. You know, there's ways that when you translate a book, you're moving it from one cultural universe into another, and it becomes part of our conversations here. And I think the Stellenwert, the relative significance of the work is different. There's also, you know, because the US has kept, you know, our borders so shamefully closed, you know, talking about the arrival of refugees seems really different here than in Germany. But I feel like that book, to me, Go Went Gone seems written with a purpose. And I think that she had like a mission writing that book. And because of that, and the mission is to make sure that German readers understand the effects of the very restrictive asylum laws governing immigration to Germany. I think she wants to spread the word so that people can't say oh, we didn't know we had laws that do that. You know, we didn't know we had laws that say that, you know, if you, you know, arrived in Italy, then you're not allowed to apply for asylum in Germany, you know, where I think a lot of people in Germany are comfortably ignorant of the laws that govern life. And I think she was on a mission to educate her fellow Germans about that. And because of that, I think there's a lot of explaining in the book. And that explaining, I think, makes things less confusing for the American reader, because she is doing so much explaining. If the book hadn't been, I mean, if I say didactic, that sounds like that's a derogatory word, but I think that she's doing a lot of teaching in the book and a lot of explaining, which helps the work in translation in that sense. That would be nice. Yeah. That almost never works. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let me start with that one. The last thing a U.S. publisher wants to do is publish a book that's not going to sell any copies. And if it's a book by somebody who, you know, you've never heard the name before, people aren't going to buy it. I got incredibly lucky to be paired with her as a translator, and this only, I mean, usually the way books get into English is that the editors of the German language publishing houses have professional relationships with editors in, you know, all over the world, but including in US. And every year they will meet, and the German editors come, you know, travel all over the world for this, but they also come to New York and meet with publishers and say, hey, so of the 12 books I published this year, I think these 2 might be interesting to you particularly, and we'll bring books and push the projects, and the American publishers will take a certain number of projects. And her book was weird, and it appealed to New Directions, and the editor successfully sold the book to New Directions. And then New Directions was looking for a translator, and they asked Michael Henry Heim if he wanted to translate the book. But there was a backstory that half a year before that, the Goethe Institute had funded a translator's study trip through Germany and invited 10 translators to spend like 2 weeks traveling through Germany, meeting publishers and literature centers. And we visited lots of publishing houses, and everywhere we went, there would be a little table of books, and the publishers would say, well, take a book on your way out. And I had picked up her book at her publishing house because I thought, oh, this cover looks neat. Oh, this first page looks neat. So I had taken that book and had been reading, so Story of the Old Child. I had read that book on the train. And this was, you know, 20 years ago. This was 15 years ago. And I was, you know, a younger, unknown translator at the time, pretty young. I was the youngest one on the trip. It was me and all my translation heroes were on the trip. Really, it was like Krishna Winston was on the trip, Brianne Mitchell, Michael Henry Heim, John Woods. There were all these leading master translators from German to English on the trip, and I was the baby. So I spent all this time with them, and I was like, on the train we were all reading the books we were picking up and talking about them, and I was just like, I love this book, oh my God, I love this book so much. So I had ranted about how much I loved this book, and when Michael Henry Heim was offered the gig, I don't know if he turned it down because he didn't have time, or if he just, but he remembered that I loved the book, and he told the publishing house, why don't you ask Susan, I know she loves this book. And so that's how I got to do the book. I have often discovered writers that I've tried to place with American publishing houses without success. Sometimes it can happen, but the publishing houses are only publishing a couple of titles a year in translation from a given language, and they already have like filled those slots with books that have come through their regular channels, and then to add that is complicated. And as to the other question, I mean, I can't exactly say, you know, what Jenny's, you know, and that's a question for her, you know, what her feelings are. My feeling is that the character of Richard is a amalgam of her husband, and her father. But, you know, that's me guessing.
But as a translator, you must have had some idea, like as you're translating him.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I associate the character with her, but that's my reading, you know. That's a question for her. No.
on to the particular work.
I don't know if there's continuity between the works.
But that's just a question if there is.
That's a good question, though. I hope, you know what, that's really interesting. I mean, I hope there is, because she has a voice, and I feel like I'm seeing her voice consistently, but I don't know if I'm actually like within the work, yes, within the work, I'm always making lists of things to, like, words, keywords, like use this word again in phrases. I'll keep a little file like that in my computer, and I'm always, because you can search so easily, I'm always searching back and forth. How did I translate that the last time? Like, obsessively, because I'm like, she is obsessive about the same thing coming back again, these constant reoccurrence of things. It's like contrapuntal. That's for her so important, so I'm like obsessive about that. But I don't even know how I would go about doing it between the books, but it's actually a good point.
Since you mentioned that a lot of publishers like to work with the same translator for this purpose.
And the same editor, too. It's like all of her books have been edited by the same person, I think for exactly that purpose. Yeah. But it's like, I feel like, you know, when you're first learning to translate, you're doing it a lot with your brain, and the more you translate, the more, you know, it's like anything. The more you get comfortable with it, the more you do it instinctually in your belly, and you I don't know. I feel like I feel her voice as consistent, and I hope that means I write her voice as consistent, but I don't know that I do. Like, somebody who's read more than one of my translations might be able to say that more than I can say it, in a way. That's actually a really good question. Thank you. I think it's a really good practice. Like, for a practicing professional literary translator, this would have two forms. One is the stealth gloss, a term coined, I believe, by Jason Grunewald. The stealth gloss is a tiny bit of information inserted into the text to make here's an example, because I was just reading Janet Malcolm's essay Socks, in which she talks about different Tolstoy translations, and she talks about a couple of them that are, anyway, she's describing that some person has bands of linen wrapped around his foot. And one of the translators said, instead of socks. For you to understand, okay, you know, he's got bands of linen wrapped around his, in Russian there's probably a word for the bands of linen you wrap around your foot if you don't have socks, but you do have like old linen that you can tear up and make bands to put, you know, inside your shoe, because it, you know, keeps it from scouring, and it keeps you warmer, and it's much better than being barefoot in your shoe. And one of the translators just added the phrase instead of socks to clarify something that to the Russian reader presumably would have been clear, but to the English reader would be like, why is he wrapping his foot? It's like a mummy. That's strange. Why? So that's a stealth gloss. It's just a little bit of information added, minimal, just a couple of words. You don't want to go, you know, hiding a whole footnote in there. But I'm really big on the translators afterward, in which I will talk about things that I feel got lost. Like in my translation of Kafka's Metamorphosis, he's got a leitmotif in there that I couldn't represent, the word ruhig, which means calm, peaceful, quiet. And if you count the number of times the words ruhig and unruhig appear in the text, easy, uneasy, it's dozens of times. It's like the word that appears most often after, you know, the, a, and in that book. And I could not find one English word that I thought would work throughout in all the different ways he uses it as a leitmotif. And so rather than trying to like artificially make one English word sort of seem to sort of fit, even though it didn't, I translated the word in many different ways, and then just in the translators afterward note that this is a leitmotif in the book, and every time you read words that refer to quiet and peacefulness, they're part of this leitmotif. So I love translators forwards and afterwards. You know, it gives you a chance to tell a little backstory about what you couldn't do in the translation. Yeah. This is a good question. Translation is tons of fun. It's like you're writing a book, but you don't have to think of what comes next. The author has done that, but you get all the fiddling. I always as a writer, I mean, I did an MFA in fiction writing, and I still I'm writing a biography right now. I still write things a lot, but there's a pleasure in somebody else guiding you. And I always my favorite part of writing has always been messing with the sounds of a sentence and the balance of the sentence. And translation has that getting to play with language, all these really fun parts for me, all the funnest parts of writing. But it also has this solving crossword puzzles aspect. A translation, every sentence gives you puzzles that require solving, and I always enjoyed solving puzzles. Yeah, I don't know. Lydia Davis has a essay. It first was on the 11 pleasures of translating, and now it's up to on the 17 pleasures of translating. If you Google that, Lydia Davis, pleasures of translating, she has a whole all the things she loves about translating. It's also you're in conversation with someone. Writing is lonely, but translation is you're talking to the author the entire time. It feels like a conversation, even though you're doing all the talking. In fact, it's basically just projection, and probably I'm a head case for doing this, but it's really, if you haven't tried it, try it sometime. It's really fun. And the moment, if you haven't tried it, you have no idea how much fun it is. It's much less about the dictionary than you would think. And I tell my students, I teach translation regularly, and I tell my students the bilingual dictionary is your crutch but not your friend. There's so much more to playing with language than a bilingual dictionary will ever tell you. You need your imagination so much, and it's really about hearing what this text sounds like in English that was in another language that does things English could never do. So what is it going to sound like? I recommend everybody try it at some point. Why not now?
We know that tomorrow morning, some of you
yeah.
you have the opportunity to play and puzzle and have some pleasure in working more with Susan on translation.
I swear it will be fun. I swear it will be fun.
But for today, we just want to thank you for wonderful
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.